the universe had always been vast, filled with countless alien civilizations, each proud of their history, their might, and their superior technologies. Among them, humanity was often dismissed as a primitive species, a young race with limited resources and no chance of ever claiming a place in the stars. The galaxy had been divided into powerful factions that controlled vast territories, and Earth had long been relegated to a distant, insignificant corner of the cosmos. But the Earthlings had a spirit no alien empire could understand, the indomitable will to survive and fight for freedom, no matter the odds. It was the technocracy of Xar, a highly advanced alien race, that would be the catalyst for the human rebellion. For centuries, the technocracy had watched humanity from afar, observing their progress but dismissing their potential. They were content to let humanity develop on their own, in their corner of the galaxy, as long as they remained ignorant of the larger galactic stage. That was until the technocracy discovered that Earth had begun to develop faster-than-light travel, an invention that would unlock humanity's potential and grant them access to the galaxy's deepest corners. The Xar Empire saw this as a threat to their hegemony. Fearing humanity's rapid advancement and the chaos their newfound knowledge could cause, the Xar sent their fleets to Earth. It was not a diplomatic mission. There would be no offers of alliances or peaceful negotiations. The Xar had only one message for Earth: submit to our rule or face annihilation. But Earth, as it had always been, was not easily subdued. At first, the humans resisted in the only way they knew how, with the strength of their resolve. They gathered their meager resources and launched a defense, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The Xar's fleets were equipped with advanced weaponry and technology that humanity could not even comprehend. Earth's leaders were faced with a brutal choice: bend to the will of the alien invaders or risk extinction. But in the darkest hour, something incredible happened. A few scattered human colonies, who had already begun to explore the stars, sent out desperate distress signals. Among them were young men and women who had trained their whole lives for a chance to defend their home. They had studied military tactics, engineering, and the science of warfare, not knowing that the universe was about to demand everything they had. They were ready to fight. Back on Earth, a ragtag group of military commanders and strategists formed an alliance. They were led by General Alex Carter, a decorated war hero who had risen through the ranks of the United Earth Federation's military. Carter was a man of conviction, a leader who believed in the power of humanity's resilience. Despite Earth's lack of advanced technology, he knew one thing the Xar did not: humanity's unwavering desire for freedom. And Carter was willing to stake everything on that belief. As the first wave of Xar ships descended on Earth's atmosphere, Carter gathered his forces in a hidden underground facility. With the resources they had available, they began to develop guerrilla warfare tactics, making use of every available weapon, every scrap of technology, and every ounce of human ingenuity. They would fight not just for survival, but for the future of their children, for the future of their species. It would not be easy. They were vastly outnumbered, their technology inferior, and their resources limited. But they had something no alien empire could understand: a fierce determination to never give up, no matter the cost. As the battle for Earth began, it quickly became clear that the Xar had underestimated humanity's resolve. The first skirmishes were brutal, with many lives lost on both sides. The Xar's superior technology was met with the clever, adaptive tactics of human forces, who used every advantage they had, from the urban jungle of Earth's cities to the rugged terrain of their battlefields. They fought like animals backed into a corner, clawing and biting with everything they had. And in the midst of it all, General Carter gave his rallying speech. Standing before his troops, who had been through the worst of the fighting, he declared, "We will not surrender. We will not retreat. We will stand until the last of us is standing, and we will fight for freedom. This is our world, our home, and no one is going to take it from us." Those words ignited something in the hearts of every soldier, every civilian, every fighter. They were no longer just defending Earth, they were fighting for the very soul of humanity itself. As the Xar forces advanced, they could not have predicted the tenacity of their human adversaries. The war for Earth had begun, and the galaxy would soon learn that humanity would never surrender, never retreat, no matter the odds. The first wave of Tsar ships had been pushed back, but it was only a temporary victory. Earth's defenders, though resilient and resourceful, were still vastly outclassed by the alien technology. Their victories in the skirmishes were the result of sheer willpower, not technological advantage, and as the days wore on, the true scale of the war began to settle in. The Tsar, though initially caught off guard, quickly adjusted. They were a race that had conquered entire worlds through calculated military tactics, overwhelming firepower, and technological superiority. Their fleets consisted of ships that could obliterate entire cities with a single blast, and their soldiers were genetically enhanced, bred for one purpose: domination. Yet, they were not prepared for the human spirit, that stubborn drive that refused to back down, no matter how bleak the situation seemed. In the underground bunkers beneath the shattered cities of Earth, General Carter gathered his most trusted advisors. Every day, their ranks were thinning. Human casualties were mounting as the Tsar pressed harder into Earth's defenses, and yet Carter saw no signs of retreat in his soldiers. They were battered and weary, but there was a fire in their eyes that refused to be extinguished. The resistance was not merely fighting for survival, they were fighting for their freedom and their way of life. "This war is not just about taking back our planet," Carter said, pacing before his gathered commanders. "We're fighting for every colony, every settlement we've built beyond Earth. The Tsar have invaded every corner of the galaxy, and now they've set their sights on us. We can't let them win. Not here. Not now. The whole galaxy is watching. If we fall, every other civilization will fall with us." His words resonated deeply. The fight was no longer about just Earth. It was about something larger, the preservation of freedom across the galaxy. Earth's last hope was not in its technology, but in its people's ability to unite and resist the overwhelming force of the Tsar Empire. Back on the front lines, the battle raged on. Earth's cities were crumbling under the might of the alien onslaught. The Tsar had begun deploying massive war machines, colossal mechanical beasts that marched across the Earth's landscape, destroying anything in their path. The human military had no way of matching the firepower of these machines, but they had something the Tsar did not: a knack for improvisation. As the Tsar forces neared the United Earth Federation's last stronghold in New York City, a small group of human engineers, led by Lieutenant Maya Clark, began working around the clock. They weren't building weapons of mass destruction; instead, they were designing traps and ambushes, using the ruins of the cities as a battleground. Clark and her team repurposed old Earth tanks, retooled spacecraft, and scavenged whatever alien tech they could capture from downed Tsar ships. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. They built improvised weapons and set up explosive traps, taking advantage of the aliens' overconfidence and reliance on brute strength. The Tsar didn't know it yet, but they were about to face the most dangerous foe they had ever encountered, a people willing to fight back with everything they had, no matter how little it seemed. The first ambush came when a group of Tsar war machines, advancing through the rubble-strewn streets of New York, suddenly found themselves surrounded by human soldiers. The humans had placed mines beneath the city's foundation, leading the machines into a maze of narrow streets where they couldn't deploy their full strength. The Tsar forces were thrown into chaos as buildings crumbled, and the ground beneath them exploded. The victory was small, but it was significant. For the first time, the Tsar felt the sting of human resistance, a reminder that Earth wasn't an easy target. The human strategy was one of attrition, bleeding the Tsar forces slowly while using the planet's terrain to their advantage. And then came the reinforcements. The colonies, scattered across the stars, had not stood idly by. Earth's plea for help had been answered. A fleet of human ships, armed with salvaged alien tech and weapons developed by Earth's finest scientists, arrived in the system. They were led by Admiral Sarah Calloway, a seasoned military leader who had survived the early days of the conflict on Mars. Calloway brought with her the resolve of an entire generation that had lived through the harsh realities of space colonization. The human fleet wasn't large, but it was fast, and it was fierce. Calloway knew that Earth had no hope of winning a conventional space battle against the Tsar, so she relied on hit-and-run tactics, using the asteroids and debris fields around Earth to keep the Tsar forces off balance. Together, the forces on the ground and in space began to push the Tsar back. The first signs of success were subtle but undeniable. In every skirmish, in every ambush, the Tsar forces were losing ground. The once feared invaders were starting to realize that they were not facing an easy victory. As Carter and his team watched the results of the latest battles unfold on their war maps, a grim smile crossed his face. The resistance was gaining momentum. Earth was far from beaten. The Tsar may have underestimated humanity at first, but now they were about to learn the hardest lesson of all: humanity would never surrender. Humanity would never retreat. And in the hearts of the human fighters, the words of General Carter echoed louder than ever before: "We will stand, until the last of us is standing." The momentum of the war had begun to shift. After weeks of relentless fighting, the human resistance had found its rhythm. Though the odds remained overwhelmingly stacked against them, the humans had learned to adapt, improvising and innovating in ways the Tsar could never have anticipated. Every ambush, every surprise attack, chipped away at the once unstoppable Tsar war machine. General Carter's rallying cry, "No surrender, no retreat," became the anthem of the resistance. It was more than just words, it was a promise. The Tsar, initially dismissive of the humans as a disorganized, primitive species, were now facing a growing problem. Their advanced weaponry, fleets, and superior tactics had failed to crush the rebellion. The humans had turned the tables. Each battle felt like a test of the Tsar's resolve, and more often than not, they were coming up short. For the first time, the Tsar began to realize that they weren't just fighting for Earth anymore. They were fighting for their empire's reputation, and for their survival. In the heart of the resistance, General Carter and his commanders huddled around a massive table, covered in holographic maps of Earth and the surrounding space. The human fleet had pushed the Tsar into a corner, forcing them to abandon some of their key planetary assault groups. The first real victory had been won at the Battle of the Tigris Belt, where the human fleet had ambushed a Tsar supply convoy, cutting off critical reinforcements. Without their vital supply lines, the Tsar's war effort had stalled. "We've got them on the ropes," Carter said, his voice steady but laced with the exhaustion of someone who had been in the trenches for far too long. "But we can't let up. This is the chance we've been waiting for." But victory was never as simple as it seemed. The Tsar had a secret weapon, one they had been holding in reserve. The Sathorax, an ancient weapon of mass destruction buried deep within the heart of Tsar territory, was about to be unleashed. The Sathorax was a superweapon capable of destroying entire planets in the blink of an eye. The resistance had heard whispers of the weapon, but until now, it had been little more than a legend. Now, it was real. And it was coming for Earth. As the Tsar forces scrambled to deploy the Sathorax, General Carter faced a terrifying decision. If the Sathorax fired, Earth would be obliterated, and the entire resistance would be wiped out in an instant. They had no way of stopping it, or so they thought. It was Lieutenant Maya Clark, the brilliant engineer who had been behind the guerrilla tactics that had given humanity its first successes, who came up with a plan. Clark had spent sleepless nights studying the Tsar technology, looking for any weaknesses. If they couldn't destroy the Sathorax, she realized, they would have to disable it. Clark discovered a hidden vulnerability in the Sathorax's energy grid, a small but critical flaw that, if exploited, could render the superweapon useless. The mission was daring, nearly impossible. Clark and a small team of engineers would need to infiltrate the heavily fortified Tsar base, sabotage the Sathorax's core, and escape before the weapon was activated. It was a suicide mission, but it was humanity's only chance. Clark's team was a mix of soldiers, engineers, and scientists, all of them volunteers, all of them driven by the same desperate need to save Earth. They were not the elite forces of the military, but they were determined. Carter knew the risks, but he also knew that if anyone could pull it off, it was them. The team infiltrated the Tsar base under the cover of darkness, using the alien tech they had scavenged to cloak their presence. Every step of the way was fraught with danger, and the Tsar were not making it easy. Patrols roamed the base, and automated security drones scanned the facility for any sign of human intruders. It was a race against time, as the Satharax's activation was only hours away. Lieutenant Clark, leading the charge, navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the Tsar fortress, heart pounding in her chest. With every step, the weight of the mission pressed down on her. The entire human race was depending on her success. As they reached the central chamber where the Satharax was stored, Clark's team split into two groups, one to disable the weapon, the other to provide cover in case things went wrong. It was a tense, nail-biting few moments as Clark and her team worked furiously, rerouting power lines, hacking into the Tsar systems, and scrambling to disable the superweapon's core. They could hear the low hum of the Satharax's reactors charging, and they knew they were running out of time. And then, disaster struck. The Tsar, having finally realized the breach in their base, launched an assault. The alarms blared as waves of Tsar soldiers stormed the facility, and the human team found themselves in a desperate firefight. Clark and her engineers worked as quickly as they could, but the Tsar were relentless. With every second that passed, the chances of success grew slimmer. The Satharax's countdown was nearing its final stages. In a final, desperate act, Clark activated the shutdown sequence, triggering a cascade of feedback throughout the Tsar base. The explosion that followed was massive, but not enough to trigger the Satharax's full power. The team had succeeded, the weapon had been neutralized. But the cost had been high. The Tsar base erupted in fire and debris, and many of Clark's team did not make it out alive. Clark, bloodied and bruised, staggered back to the remaining escape ship, clutching the mission's success in her hands. As the ship lifted off, she looked down at Earth below, scarred but still standing. The Tsar had lost their trump card. The resistance had won a decisive victory. But the war was far from over. The destruction of the Satharax was a monumental turning point in humanity's war for freedom. The weapon that could have wiped Earth from existence was no longer a threat, and the Tsar had suffered a crushing defeat. The news spread quickly through the resistance, the human spirit had triumphed again. But for those on the ground, the victory came at a cost. Lieutenant Maya Clark and her team had paid with their lives to ensure that Earth would have a future. Their sacrifice was not forgotten, but their absence left a void in the hearts of those who had come to depend on their ingenuity and courage. General Carter stood before a memorial erected in honor of Clark and her team. It was a simple, somber affair, no grand speeches or celebrations. Just a quiet moment of reflection. His face, weathered and worn from the months of endless conflict, betrayed no emotion. But inside, the weight of their loss gnawed at him. They had won a battle, yes. But the war was far from over, and he couldn't afford to let the victory distract him from the bigger picture. "We still have a long road ahead of us," Carter said to his commanders, gathering them in a secure briefing room. "The Tsar won't back down just because we took out their superweapon. They've got resources we can't even imagine. This isn't just about Earth anymore, it's about the entire galaxy. If we let them regroup, they'll come back stronger than before." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Carter's words sinking in. Every victory they achieved was a step closer to winning, but every step came with more sacrifices. The war had consumed entire generations of humanity. Families had been torn apart. Cities had been reduced to rubble. And yet, the fire of resistance burned brighter than ever. Admiral Sarah Calloway, leader of the human fleet, spoke up. "We've hit them hard, but we need to keep the pressure on. We can't let them consolidate their forces. If we don't strike while they're weakened, they'll regroup and hit us with everything they've got." Carter nodded. "We've got a small window of opportunity before they can rebuild. Let's hit their supply lines, their command structures, everything. We go on the offensive, and we don't stop until they know they're not welcome here." Meanwhile, in the Tsar Empire's command center, the loss of the Satharax had shaken the entire structure of their military might. The Tsar had long considered themselves the apex of galactic evolution, their technology, their warriors, their empire, all were supposed to be invincible. Now, the humans had shown them that they were fallible. The humiliation of losing to a species they had once regarded as inferior stung deeply. The Tsar High Command convened to address the crisis. Supreme Commander Vorith, leader of the Tsar military, was not a man accustomed to defeat. His race had conquered dozens of worlds and crushed rebellions before they could even begin to organize. But Earth was different. Earth fought with a ferocity that Vorith had not anticipated. The humans were resourceful, relentless, and worse still, united in a way that no alien species could understand. Vorith knew that if the Tsar were to maintain their dominance, they needed to strike back decisively. "We will not be humiliated by these primitive creatures," Vorith snarled, his claws tapping against the steel table. "Send a message to the humans. We will show them what happens when they defy the Tsar Empire." The Tsar began mobilizing what remained of their forces. Their fleets, though battered, were still formidable. Their war machines were being rebuilt, their weapons recharged. But Vorith had one final, devastating plan to crush the resistance once and for all, an all-out invasion of Earth's remaining strongholds. They would use a combination of overwhelming firepower and psychological warfare to break humanity's spirit. The humans had learned to fight back, but now they would learn what it meant to face true destruction. Back on Earth, the resistance was preparing for the counterattack. The victory over the Sathraks had given them hope, but they knew that the Tsar were not going to give up so easily. General Carter's strategy was one of resilience. They would stand firm, no matter the cost. But even he knew that the next wave of Tsar forces could be the end of everything they had fought for. "They're coming for us," Carter said, his voice grim as he addressed his soldiers. "The Tsar aren't going to stop. They'll try to break us, but we won't let them. We will fight for every inch of this planet, for every human life, and for our future. We will not give up. We will not retreat. We will never surrender." The words were met with a resounding cheer. The soldiers, civilians, and resistance fighters who had gathered in the war room knew the stakes. The war had already cost them so much. Families, cities, entire communities had been lost. But they had something the Tsar couldn't understand, an unbreakable will to survive. The countdown had begun. In a matter of days, the Tsar would be upon them. And humanity's final stand would be fought not just with weapons, but with the spirit of a people who refused to bow before any empire. As the days passed, the resistance fortified their positions, preparing for the inevitable. They had no illusions about the challenge that lay ahead. The Tsar would bring their full wrath down upon Earth, and the cost of this battle would be steep. But General Carter was resolute. They had fought too long, lost too much, to give up now. This was the moment of truth. Earth's last defenders would rise up and face their greatest challenge yet. And the Tsar would learn, in no uncertain terms, that humanity would not go quietly into the night. The calm before the storm felt like an eternity. Every moment that passed brought humanity closer to their darkest hour. Earth's remaining strongholds were fortified, supply lines stretched thin, and every soldier knew that the Tsar invasion would be unlike anything they had faced. General Carter stood before his troops, his expression hard as iron. He could feel the weight of every decision, every sacrifice, every life that had been lost in the struggle to get to this point. He knew this could be the final battle. "Listen up," he barked, his voice carrying over the makeshift command center. "We've been through hell, and now they're bringing the fight to us. The Tsar are coming in full force. We're outnumbered, and we're outgunned. But we've got something they don't, heart. We've fought for every inch of this planet, and we'll fight for it until the last one of us is standing. I don't need to tell you what's at stake. This is our world. And we will never surrender." The resistance fighters, weathered and battle-worn, stood to attention. They had already given so much. The thought of retreat was unthinkable. As one, they shouted back in unison, "No surrender. No retreat." Above Earth, in orbit, the Tsar fleet was assembling. Massive warships, their sleek surfaces glistening in the cold black of space, moved into position. Supreme Commander Vorith watched the human defenses through the tactical holograms, a cold smile playing across his face. This time, they would leave no room for humanity to fight back. The Tsar were bringing every available resource to bear, and they had learned from their mistakes. The humans had become a thorn in their side, but Vorith would end that once and for all. "We will break them," he muttered to himself. "The humans are weak, and they will bend to the will of the Tsar Empire." Vorith's strategy was simple yet devastating. His forces would strike at Earth's core, targeting the Resistance's strongest positions and destroying them with overwhelming force. He would crush their morale with the sheer weight of his fleet. Humanity had been resourceful, but they were nothing compared to the Tsar war machine. But what Vorith did not expect was the tenacity of the human spirit. Carter, and the Resistance commanders, had studied every move the Tsar had made. They knew the patterns of the Tsar's fleet and their weaknesses. They had learned to predict their strategies and had prepared their own traps that were ready to be sprung. The first wave of the Tsar fleet descended upon Earth, bombarding the planet's surface with precision strikes. Entire cities were wiped off the map as orbital bombardment tore through buildings and infrastructure. The Resistance's main strongholds, located in the mountainous regions and the deep forests of Earth, were hit hardest. But the humans didn't flinch. They dug in, deploying their own counterattacks with the remnants of their makeshift technology. Anti-aircraft guns, advanced explosives, and adapted alien tech fired back with furious intensity. The battle lines were drawn in the dirt, and each explosion felt like a call to arms, a rallying cry to stand and fight. In the skies above, the human fleet, small but mighty, met the Tsar head-on. Admiral Calloway led the charge, her battle-hardened ships darting through the debris of shattered space stations and asteroid fields. The Tsar's immense warships were a sight to behold, but their size also made them vulnerable. The human fleet was fast and nimble, striking with surgical precision. Calloway's tactics relied on speed and misdirection. The Tsar's weapons were powerful, but they struggled to hit fast-moving targets. The humans had developed their own form of hit-and-run warfare, using their knowledge of space terrain to gain the upper hand. But even the human fleet couldn't hold off the Tsar forever. The alien forces responded with overwhelming numbers, launching a full assault on Earth's remaining military assets. Tsar command ships, brimming with elite warriors, descended into the atmosphere, preparing to deploy their invasion forces. The ground forces were already moving. Enormous Tsar war machines, towering mechanical behemoths, began their descent toward Earth's surface. On the ground, General Carter watched as the first of the Tsar's massive assault units landed. The Earth's defenders scrambled to respond, but they were outnumbered. Carter gripped his weapon, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. This was it, the final confrontation. "We fight for humanity's future," Carter said to his commanders, his voice steady. "We don't back down. We hold the line." The battle raged on, and the tide seemed to turn in favor of the Tsar as their reinforcements landed. The war machines marched forward, unleashing waves of destruction. But the humans refused to give up. Every inch of ground they lost, they retook with blood and sweat. Civilians, who had once been ordinary citizens, had taken up arms, defending their homes and families from the alien invaders. There were no more lines between soldiers and civilians. They were all defenders of Earth. Amid the chaos, Lieutenant Clark's old team, the engineers who had once sabotaged the Sathraks, had put their skills to use once more. They had crafted new weapons, developed new traps, and repurposed alien tech for one final push. They understood that they couldn't defeat the Tsar with brute force alone. They would have to use strategy, innovation, and their surroundings to win. With Clark's legacy in their hearts, they prepared to launch a final assault on the Tsar Command Center, a heavily fortified structure deep within the heart of Earth's urban ruins. The plan was simple: cripple the Tsar's ability to coordinate the invasion by cutting off their communications and command infrastructure. If they could sever the head of the Tsar war machine, the rest of the body would fall. As the resistance fighters infiltrated the heart of the Tsar's operation, General Carter's voice echoed over comms, "This is it, everyone. We break their command, and we break their will. They'll know we're not going down without a fight. For Earth. For humanity." The final push had begun. The command center loomed ahead, buried deep beneath the ruins of Earth's largest city. The once vibrant streets now stood as graveyards of civilization, a testament to the destruction the Tsar had wrought. Amidst the rubble, the resistance made their final stand. General Carter's strategy had led them this far, but the endgame was at hand. If they were to win, they needed to strike at the heart of the Tsar war machine, the source of their coordination, their power, and their control. The resistance fighters, though weary and scarred by months of relentless conflict, were resolute. They had endured countless battles and faced overwhelming odds, but their unity, their spirit, had kept them going. The time for tactics and strategy was over. It was now a fight of pure will. Earth's defenders had one last chance to turn the tide of war, to secure the future of their world, or die trying. General Carter stood before his command, his face lined with fatigue but hardened by determination. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "This is our final push," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the midst of the storm. "We go in hard, we hit them fast, and we finish this. Whatever happens, we fight for Earth. We fight for humanity." A chorus of agreement rippled through the room. The soldiers, engineers, and civilians-turned-fighters were ready. There would be no retreat, no surrender. They were going to win or die trying. It was a simple, brutal truth that carried them forward. Meanwhile, deep in the Tsar Command Center, Supreme Commander Vorith paced back and forth. The humans had proven more resilient than he could have imagined, and their strikes were becoming more effective. His once overwhelming advantage had been eroded, and he knew his forces were on the brink of collapse. His fleet had been battered, his war machines defeated, and Earth's defenses were holding strong. Yet, the Tsar were not easily defeated. They would fight to the bitter end, and Vorith had one last card to play. The Tsar had hidden a second superweapon, one that would devastate Earth's defenses once and for all. A weapon even more terrifying than the Sathorax. This weapon was not a bomb or a missile, but a massive, planet-killing energy cannon embedded deep within the Tsar Command Center. If activated, it could obliterate Earth's surface, wiping out humanity in an instant. Vorith had kept it in reserve, but now, with defeat on the horizon, he had no choice but to use it. "We will break them," Vorith snarled, voice trembling with barely contained rage. "If we cannot have this world, then no one will." But the Tsar were not the only ones with a hidden weapon. In the ruins, a small group of resistance fighters, led by Lieutenant Clark's former team of engineers, had infiltrated the Tsar base. Their mission was clear: destroy the energy cannon before it could fire. They had spent weeks planning and gathering resources, combining human ingenuity with salvaged alien technology to create a makeshift solution. They weren't warriors by trade, but they were the last hope of humanity. With every step, the pressure mounted. The Tsar base was crawling with elite soldiers, patrols, and automated defense systems. But the resistance team, with their knowledge of Tsar tech and tactics, moved swiftly and silently, evading detection at every turn. The further they pushed into the heart of the Tsar command, the closer they came to the weapon that could end it all. Clark's team reached the control room. The massive energy cannon stood in the center, surrounded by a sea of Tsar technicians and soldiers, preparing it for launch. Time was running out. They had no more than a few minutes before the weapon would be activated. With no room for hesitation, they set to work. "Plant the charges on the main conduits," Clark's former second-in-command, Sergeant O'Neill, instructed. "We take out the power supply, and that'll disable the whole system." As the team worked, Clark's old friend, now a seasoned fighter, kept watch, scanning for any signs of movement. The tension was palpable. They could hear the Tsar discussing the final preparations for the cannon's activation, the faint hum of energy building in the room. But despite the risk, the team pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the fate of the entire human race rested in their hands. Meanwhile, outside the command center, General Carter and his forces launched their final assault. They struck with everything they had left, every soldier, every piece of technology, every ounce of energy was focused on one goal: to break through the Tsar's defenses and buy Clark's team enough time to complete their mission. The battle was fierce, chaotic, and unrelenting. The Tsar fought with brutal efficiency, but the human resistance, backed by sheer determination, pushed forward. Carter, leading the charge, fought side by side with his soldiers. The Tsar's war machines loomed overhead, and the blasts of energy from the Tsar's weapons tore into the Earth's surface, but the humans stood firm. Every step, every breath, every movement was an act of defiance. They refused to be cowed. As the energy cannon powered up, a brilliant flash of light erupted from the Tsar base. It was a beacon of destruction, a final, devastating blow meant to shatter Earth and end humanity's fight. But in that moment, the unexpected happened. The cannon sputtered, crackled, and then fell silent. The team of engineers had succeeded. The power supply to the cannon had been severed. It would never fire. In that instant, the resistance fighters launched their final offensive. With the Tsar command structure crippled, their forces began to collapse. The human fleet struck again, tearing into the Tsar ships above, and the ground forces pushed forward with renewed strength. The Tsar, reeling from the loss of their weapon and their command, began to falter. Supreme Commander Vorith, realizing that his empire's last hope had been shattered, made one final, desperate attempt to turn the tide. But it was too late. The humans had broken through. The Tsar were retreating. Earth had won. The battlefield was eerily silent, the aftermath of destruction stretching as far as the eye could see. The skies, once filled with the blackened wings of the Tsar warships, were now clear, and the ground, though scarred and broken, stood as a testament to humanity's resilience. Earth had not only survived, but had triumphed. The Tsar forces, broken and disoriented, had retreated into the void, leaving behind a planet that had been tested to its very core. General Carter stood amidst the wreckage, his once pristine uniform now torn and stained with dirt and blood. The weight of the victory settled upon him slowly, like the calm after a storm. He had led humanity through the darkest chapter of their history, and now, as the dust settled, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. "We did it," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice carried the weight of all the sacrifices, all the lives lost, and all the moments of doubt they had fought through. Around him, the remnants of the resistance gathered. Soldiers, engineers, scientists, civilians, all those who had fought in the trenches, who had taken up arms to defend their world. Though weary, there was a spark in their eyes. They had won. Against all odds, they had beaten the Tsar Empire, and the thought of it filled their hearts with pride. But even now, there was no time for celebration. Earth was not the same world it had once been. Admiral Sarah Calloway approached Carter, her face reflecting the same fatigue but also a fierce determination. "We've held our ground, but we can't stop now," she said, her voice steady. "The Tsar are gone for now, but their empire is vast. There's no telling what they'll do next. We need to rebuild, to fortify our defenses, and prepare for whatever comes next." Carter nodded. "I know. But for today, let's give ourselves the space to breathe. Tomorrow, we'll get back to work. Humanity's fight isn't over, but we've earned this moment." The human fleet, battered but victorious, gathered in orbit around Earth. The ships that had once been a ragtag assembly of disparate forces now stood as a symbol of unity and strength. A fleet forged in the fires of war, ready to defend Earth and ensure that the Tsar would never again threaten their home. Meanwhile, the world below began its own recovery. Cities that had been reduced to rubble started to rebuild, not just from the physical destruction, but from the emotional scars as well. Families reunited, communities began to heal, and Earth's people found strength in each other. The war had cost them dearly, but it had also brought them closer together. One of the greatest legacies of this war was the unity it had forged among humanity. The once fragmented nations of Earth had set aside their differences and worked as one. The Tsar had underestimated humanity's greatest weapon, not their technology, not their military might, but their capacity to unite in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the weeks that followed, humanity began to reshape its future. The leaders of the resistance, now celebrated as heroes, began to forge a new global government, one that emphasized cooperation, peace, and rebuilding. Earth's military, while remaining vigilant against future threats, focused on humanitarian aid and the restoration of Earth's natural beauty, long scarred by war. The people, weary but resolute, came together to create a world that would never forget the lessons of the past. Supreme Commander Vorith and the remaining Tsar leadership, now scattered across the galaxy, were not forgotten. Their empire, once the pinnacle of galactic power, had been driven back. But the remnants of the Tsar Empire would not be content to simply fade into history. The galaxy was vast, and there would always be those who sought to bring war to the innocent. But Earth, and the united peoples of humanity, stood ready. The final days of the war had given birth to a new dawn, not just for Earth, but for humanity itself. As the sun rose over a world that had survived the darkness, General Carter stood at the head of the united forces, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady with purpose. "The galaxy is ours to shape. And as long as humanity has breath in its lungs, we will never give in. We will never surrender." The resistance fighters, the soldiers, the families, they stood with him. Together, they had defeated the impossible. And together, they would face whatever the future held. Humanity's fight for freedom was far from over. But for now, the galaxy knew this truth: humanity would not be crushed. They would not be cowed. They would never surrender. And so, with the Tsar retreating into the unknown and the dawn of a new era rising before them, Earth's people stepped forward, resolute in their commitment to rebuild and to protect the world they had fought so hard to save. For Earth. For humanity. For the future.